Hello viewers and welcome to yet another Warhammer 40,000 Conquest video production. My name is Mitch and I am the Hive Tyrant. Today I'm pleased to present the second of a series of videos in which I'll be reviewing each Warlord of our first cycle of war packs, the Warlord cycle, as well as their associated signature squad, all within the context of the card pool available when those cards' associated expansion was first released, considering that each Warlord has a unique playstyle which dictates how their surrounding deck is built and subsequently played. By covering Warlords and War Packs separately, hopefully all of these videos will remain relevant and useful to both new players and old for as long as possible. Each new future expansion should simply build upon and complement the foundation laid out by each previous publication and its associated cards. However, considering that at the time of this recording we've seen the release of our entire Warlord cycle and the Great Devourer Deluxe expansion, I will have the benefit of some foresight when it comes to assessing both the utility and potential of each of these cards. So, in this specific video, I'll be taking a look at the second Chaos Faction Warlord, Ku'gath Plaguefather, and focusing on the pros and cons of not only that Warlord unit, but also each of the different cards which constitute his signature squad. For each of these card review videos, I'll be tackling the contents of each single war pack individually. I plan to create one video to review, assess, and discuss each Warlord, and then a separate, much longer production, in which I provide an analysis and assessment of all the non-signature faction-specific cards introduced within that expansion. In doing so, I should be able to produce a nice variety of short, Warlord-centric content, as well as much longer faction or war pack-specific videos. But, with that said, on to today's Warlord, Ku'gath Plaguefather. He is a unique Warlord unit with an attack value of 1, a pool of 7 hit points, a starting hand size of 7, and with 7 starting resource tokens. He has the Demon and Nurgle traits, and reads Reaction. After this Warlord is declared as an attacker, move 1 damage from this Warlord to another unit at this planet. And on his bloodied side, he happens to lose that ability. His attack value remains at 1, but his pool of hit points drops to 5. So, whereas Zarather embraces the glass cannon playstyle, being able to output huge amounts of damage while being relatively fragile and flighty himself, Kugath is instead durable, resilient, and unrelenting, winning games somewhat more slowly and over time, as opposed to outright obliterating his opposition. He has a large pool of HP, making him very survivable, and as soon as he begins to incur damage, he's able to shift it off of himself and onto the enemy, both healing himself and serving to dole out damage tokens simultaneously. And for this very reason, it makes Kugath one of the most dangerous warlords in a one-on-one fight. Unless your opponent can front-load a large volume of damage or attack with a very high attack value unit, if Kugath does nothing but suffer small incremental amounts of damage over successive combat rounds, considering there is no limit to the number of times each turn you can trigger his reaction, then, in the right situation, it can make him seem all but invincible in being able to whittle away his opposition, even multiple units at once. And for that reason, he can be spectacular in aggressively pushing to win battles at the first planet, or simply when fighting anywhere in the Traxxas sector alone. And plus, if you back him up with events like Tzeentch's Firestorm or Archon's Terror to remove those targets he can't safely manage to deal with himself, then he only stands to become all the more daunting a battlefield presence for your opponent. And what's particularly nice about his reaction is that it's entirely separate from, but in addition to, his attack, and that moved damage cannot be prevented or mitigated limited by shield cards. So if you're fighting multiple units with Kugath, you can declare an attack against one of them and immediately move one damage token from Kugath to the other unit. And if it happens to be something like a Chimera token or an already incidentally wounded army unit such as an Honored Librarian or any other powerful army unit, his reaction can allow it to be obliterated immediately. And if you consider just how many various card effects Chaos players have and will eventually see, which allow them to deal out damage directly to their enemy, that all combines together to make Kugath's an exceptionally potent ability. And plus, seeing as how Kugath needs to take damage before he can dish it back, he even works well when you don't possess the initiative token, and that's definitely a factor that, when possible, you'll certainly want to leverage in your favor. As we'll shortly see as we begin to cover Kugath's signature squad, he has access to a wealth of different card effects which often confer some sort of healing, and that allows you to play him in a far more risky and aggressive sense than you can nearly any other Warlord, whether that be by using events which require your Warlord to exhaust, as we'll see released throughout the Warlord cycle, or otherwise through the use of cards that confer a beneficial effect yet require you take damage, like Smash and Bash or Orc Cannon. But first of our Warlord's signature squad happens to be the divisive Kugath's Nurglings, a double-edged sword of an army unit with a cost of 2, 1 command icon, an attack value of 2, and 2 hit points. They have the Demon and Nurgle traits and the forced reaction: after a unit moves to this planet, deal it 1 damage. So, in assessing their cost relative to their printed statistics, they seem entirely fair and what one would expect. And given that they're a demon, you could either sacrifice cultist tokens or a splintered path acolyte to either reduce their deployment cost or outright negate it entirely. But the real power behind these nurglings comes from their mandatory reaction. Every time an army unit moves to a planet where they happen to be located, that moved unit takes 1 shieldable point of damage. So in assessing this card, consider that deploying a unit does not count as moving a unit. The only times that a unit moves is when they are required to do so by a card effect, or when they are commit alongside a Warlord during the command phase to a planet. So for this reason, Kugath's Nurglings are great for hindering mobile units. For instance, a Vashia Trailblazer attempting to move to a Nurgling-laden planet risks being destroyed immediately unless shielded, and particularly when multiple units are all gathered and concentrated at the same planet, they together possess the potential to outright annihilate your opponent's Warlord and accompanying retinue of units if they happen to be moved from the enemy HQ to the planet where the Nurglings are sitting, which makes the Nurglings an ideal late-game deploy to the game-deciding planet. And of course, each and every Nurgling sitting at a planet does its own point of damage, each of which would need to be shielded individually. But as the Nurglings affect units controlled by any player, we also need to keep in mind that this army unit also poses a considerable danger to you as the Chaos player. If you send your own Warlord to a planet where Nurglings reside, you trigger that forced reaction and take damage just as does your enemy. Granted, that could be beneficial if you want to accumulate some damage tokens onto Kugath, perhaps, or a brutal keyword possessing units such as a Khorne Berserker, but it could also quickly become a liability, especially when you stop to consider that your own Nurglings will also damage every army unit sent from your HQ, which travels alongside your Warlord during the command phase when he's commit to a planet. Plus, it's of the utmost importance to also keep in mind that if these nurglings happen to enter your HQ, perhaps at the end of the combat phase, had they been fighting at the first planet, during the subsequent round's command phase, when they're commit alongside your Warlord to a planet of your choice, they not only deal damage to each and every other unit they traveled alongside, but they also deal damage to themselves. Every unit moves independently yet simultaneously, and each individual unit triggers that nurgling's forced reaction. So before we move on, the simultaneous forced reaction rules also indicate that Kugath's nurglings pose another significant threat to their controller. If at any point you have 2 copies of Kugath's nurglings commit to the same planet, the player holding the initiative token determines which order those forced reactions are resolved in. So, I'll try my best to explain this as clearly as possible, as it's a complicated bit of rules framework to follow. Forced reactions always attempt to resolve automatically and immediately every time their triggering condition is met, but only one single forced reaction can occur at any one time. One must be resolved completely before you can move on and resolve another, and therefore the player with initiative must decide the order that these effects are resolved in. And once a Kugath's nurglings is destroyed, potentially by its own forced reaction, it will trigger no additional subsequent forced reactions. In a sense, as soon as that copy of nurglings dies, the cycle of forced reactions is immediately broken. So, again, if there are 2 or more copies of Kugath's nurglings, which each have forced reactions needing to be resolved, the player that happens to possess the initiative token can pick an order of resolution that deals the most damage to the enemy and the least damage to their own army. Let's say, for instance, you possess the initiative token. You have Kugath, a Khorne Berserker, and 2 copies of Kugath's nurglings, all moving from your HQ to a planet. Your enemy has their Warlord and any number of army units, which also happen to be commit to that very same planet. All of them have the same destination, and all of them have been moved. That means that each and every one of them is going to trigger the forced reaction of both nurglings. If you only had 1 copy of the nurglings, every unit would simply take 1 point of damage. However, because you have 2, both copies of the nurglings will each attempt to resolve their forced reaction on each and every one of the army units I just mentioned simultaneously. But remember, each of these reactions can only physically occur one at a time. One must be resolved completely before you can move on to the next. So keep in mind that each of these instances of damage must be dealt with individually, with a unit being assigned damage and having an opportunity to shield before you move on to resolve the next forced reaction. So, if you have the initiative token, your first copy of nurglings could deal 1 damage to itself, 1 point of damage to your second copy of Kugath's nurglings, and then 1 point of damage to each of your enemy's units. Then, before your first copy of nurglings deals damage to either your Khorne Berserker or Kugath, because you determined the sequence of forced reactions, and 1 unit need not resolve all of its reactions before moving on to the next, you can have your second copy of Kugath's nurglings deal its 1 point of damage to your first copy of Kugath's nurglings. And as soon as the first nurglings die, even though they haven't triggered all of their triggered and pending forced reactions, they're suddenly no longer eligible to trigger them. They're in your discard pile, and therefore they are now not able to damage any additional units. But your second copy of nurglings is still alive at this point, and it still has forced reactions of its own to resolve. So, you can choose to have it deal 1 damage to each and every one of your enemy's units, and then, prior to your damaging any of your own, you have it deal 1 point of damage to itself. Since it had already taken a point of damage from your first copy of nurglings, your second copy of nurglings immediately dies, and it, too, is no longer eligible to keep dealing out damage. So in this situation, because you held the initiative token, you lost both of your copies of nurglings. All the units moved from your opponent's HQ took 2 individual shieldable points of damage, and the units you moved from your HQ took no damage at all. But remember that if you wanted your Berserker and or Kugath or any other units to take damage, since for both of those examples I used it could be beneficial to have them become injured, you are allowed that possibility. It's entirely your choice. But remember that as the player with the initiative token determines the order in which forced reactions take place and are resolved, if your opponent had initiative, they could have instead caused your entire army to be the side which took 2 individual instances of damage. Although you do have the opportunity to shield your nurglings from their own damage and interfere with this process, had you chosen not to or simply been unable to do so, they could have killed off both of your nurglings and dealt 2 damage to your entire army, with their own army going entirely unscathed. But in either case, once there are no remaining forced reactions, gameplay resumes as per usual, and players can then take actions like normal. So, in the right circumstance, this can make Kugath's nurglings a potentially very powerful unit, but also, at the wrong time, a tremendous liability. But with that essay of a rules explanation now very much out of the way, onto our signature attachment, the Plaguefather's Banner. It has a cost of 1, 3 shield icons, a unique icon, and the war gear and standard traits. It reads, attached to a Nurgle unit. Attached unit gets +1 HP. Reaction. After attached unit is declared as an attacker, move 1 damage from attached unit to another unit at this planet. So, this is easily one of the most powerful signature attachments in the game. It costs next to nothing, and you almost never want to discard this as a shield card. If you draw this in your opening hand, it could significantly alter the trajectory of the game, and in fact, many players consider this specific card worth taking a mulligan for in and of itself. It can be affixed to any Nurgle unit, ranging from your Kugath's nurglings, to the seldom played Death Guard infantry, to even perhaps a virulent plague squad, so that that lattermost unit can not only gain a large amount of attack value based upon the number of units in your opponent's discard pile, but that it can also make use of that banner's reaction. That way, when it's declared as an attacker, the banner can immediately kill off a weaker unit, heal the virulent plague squad, and as its attack is in the process of being resolved, none of that potentially colossal attack value need go to waste, as you're free to use it to strike a far meatier target with the potential force of a Space Hulk. But, in all honesty, who am I kidding? The obvious imperative target for this attachment, with almost no exception, needs to be Kugath. If you liked your Warlord's reaction, you will love him with this attachment. Provided that you've taken damage, this turns Kugath into a veritable monster. If he was durable before, he's all but indestructible now. If you're playing against a Dark Eldar player, for instance, you could declare an attack against an enemy army unit, and before resolving that attack, you could trigger Kugath's reaction to move a point of damage from him to a Chimera token, killing it instantly, and then trigger the Plaguefather's Banner's reaction. in order to move another point of damage from him to a different Chimera token, also serving to remove it from play immediately. Each and every time that Kugath declares an attack, he now has the opportunity to remove and relocate 2 points of damage in addition to his attack value of 1, which is almost absurd. And even if your opponent does manage to outpace and outdamage that healing effect, Kugath's signature event provides still another convenient means of maximizing your Warlord's survivability, as I'll cover in just a few minutes. Again, the best aspect of this reaction is that movement of damage bypasses any and all opportunities to shield, and moved damage does not count as assigned damage. So, just like you could kill an Honored Librarian without being able to attack it directly, you could also manage to circumvent the damage prevention effect of Blood Angel's Veterans. As they're not assigned any damage, they cannot prevent any damage, making this attachment incredibly nasty. And consider also that it confers the attached unit an additional point of HP, which would serve to bring Kugath to 8. Honestly, what more is there to say? There is very little attachment destruction or hate present in our card pool at the time of the Scourge's release, and frankly, there doesn't seem to even be much on the horizon. So for all those reasons and more, this attachment strikes me as the kind of card one would want to play the moment they draw it. Really, the only things left to consider are that if you only have 1 hit point worth of enemy units present at the planet where Kugath is fighting, he won't be able to trigger his reaction and the banner, and that if you haven't taken enough damage prior to attacking, you may not be able to trigger his reaction or the banner. But with those minor complications aside, like I said, an immensely powerful card, and with the help of a timely Warp Storm or two, an event, need I say, which a banner-wielding Kugath is entirely immune to, this kind of attachment could allow Kugath alone to take on what could potentially amount to an entire enemy army. Still, next we happen to see our signature support, Vile Laboratory. It has a cost of 2, the location trait, and deploy action. Exhaust this support to have your opponent choose and move a non-vehicle unit he controls from a target planet to an adjacent planet of his choice. So, the primary use of this card is going to be pressuring the first planet, in both a command and combat sense. If your opponent only has 1 non-vehicle unit on the first planet, you simply target that planet and he is forced to move it to planet 2. If you end up with a unit at planet 1, you could easily win command and the battle at that planet, allowing you to potentially easily add it to your victory display and trigger its associated battle ability, and in the right situation, that can provide a significant amount of pressure for your opponent's Warlord to commit to the first planet. So, played in the early game, this could easily allow you to win battles that you were otherwise destined to lose. You just pick the site of the important battle you're trying to win, and your opponent is forced to deplete their standing forces there by 1 non-vehicle unit. If they've deployed few expensive units, this could be a considerably punishing effect, and alongside events like Archon's Terror, it's another fantastic means of picking apart your opponent's army, allowing Kugath to divide and conquer. You could also use this support to force vulnerable enemy units to planets where you could opportunistically smash them, perhaps ensuring they need face down Kugath himself if you don't possess the initiative token, or some kind of hard-hitting Chaos Demon or Orc if you do have initiative. It's a deploy action which allows you to deploy stall ever so slightly, which of course serves to afford you all the more information regarding your opponent's deployments before you eventually pass. And by shifting command icon laden units, Vile Laboratory could mean that your opponent either wins only a single command struggle instead of what may have been 2, or 0 instead of 1. Granted, it isn't nearly as useful once your opponent has multiple units all stacked at the same target planet, it, but it still makes for a relatively powerful effect in helping to potentially shift the odds at least ever so slightly in your favor. And since it forces units to move, it can even result in your opponent having to trigger one or more copies of Kugath's nurglings. It works on elites, which can make for fantastic bullying value, but your opponent can also opt to move relatively less valuable tokens. So, in the right situation, it's a stellar support, but it's by no means impossible to play around. So, I think a useful tool to disrupt your opponent's best laid of plans, but not exactly one that's always simple or straightforward to use. But last of our signature squad, we have the event Feted Haze. With a cost of 3, 1 shield icon, and possessing the power and Nurgle traits, it reads combat action. Remove all damage from a target Nurgle unit you control. Then, have your opponent deal an amount of indirect damage equal to the damage removed among army units he controls at the same planet. So, if you weren't already convinced to play Kugath, this event may just end up making the difference. It's expensive and doesn't have a big associated shield value, but it grants you the opportunity to heal any target Nurgle unit you control completely, and potentially poses a tremendous threat to any present enemy army units. But in ensuring we understand this card clearly, let's consider the relevant rules. First off, you pick a Nurgle unit and remove all damage. It could be a Death Squad infantry with 1 point of damage, or it could be Kugath wielding his affixed banner with a total of 7 damage. You immediately remove each of those damage tokens, and your opponent is forced to redistribute those tokens as indirect damage, assigned to any army units they have present at that same planet. This does not affect tokens, and it does not affect warlords. Also, your opponent cannot assign more indirect damage to one unit than it has remaining hit points. So if your opponent has 6 different 2-hit point army units and needs to reassign 6 indirect damage, he could do 1 point of damage to each of the 6, or 2 damage to 3 of the 6, or mix and match those numbers however he or she would like. And for that reason, you get the most offensive use out of Feted Haze when your opponent does have a significant army presence standing at a planet, because remember, the total number of indirect damage assigned to any one unit cannot exceed the recipient unit's remaining HP. For example, let's say that Kugath has his banner attached, and you play Feted Haze on him when he has 7 points of damage. Immediately, all of that damage is removed, but if your opponent only has a 1 hit point shoot-a-mob at that planet, you can only assign it a single damage token. The remaining 6 simply cease to exist and are returned to the token bank. Your opponent then has the opportunity to shield, and in this case, a single shield icon card allows your enemy to circumvent all of what could have been 7 damage entirely. Also worth noting, perhaps if you're playing against Kugath, is that you can redistribute that Feted Haze indirect damage to as many units as possible, perhaps just to give yourself the opportunity to use as many shield cards as you can, which is something particularly useful to keep in mind if you're perhaps running the Tau unique army unit Fireblade Kyvray, who increases the shield value of each and every Tau card discarded as shields by 1. So, although this event may not be quite so powerful as first it may have seemed, I nevertheless do think it's an extremely powerful effect, and beyond being a very potent means of healing your units, it can be incredible in applying a huge amount of pressure onto your opponent to shield. Or if your opponent has run out of shields, then whether or not they're able to assign all of the indirect damage you could potentially deal, it's entirely possible that you will indeed dish out enormous amounts of damage and potentially kill off a great many enemy army units. And whether or not Kugath has his banner attached, there are few things more satisfying than slowly but surely seeing your opponent start to overcome Kugath's 1 or 2 points of damage relocation each combat round, only for you to eventually throw down a feted haze at nearly the last moment, instantly shattering your opponent's wildest hopes and dreams of perhaps somehow managing to score a bloody or kill on your Warlord. But I will also say I think it's critically important that you stay very mindful of exactly what manner of combat tricks we end up seeing that could pose a threat to your Warlord. For instance, later in the Warlord cycle, Space Marines get a convenient means of surprisingly augmenting their damage output at the very last moment, and even within the core set, effects like Ambush Platform plus Ion Rifle could result in your taking damage either much more quickly or in much less agreeable increments than you had been either hoping for or anticipating. So, definitely a powerful effect, and I certainly suggest playing it, watching your opponent distribute huge amounts of damage relatively equally among their present army units, and then following it up with a Warp Storm, and seeing if your opponent concedes. But now that we've covered the second of our Warlord cycle Warlords, that brings this video to a close. So I'll just end by saying thank you very much for watching, and I very much hope you enjoyed this assessment and analysis of our Warlord from the Scourge. Please leave a comment sharing your own thoughts, opinions, and play experiences with our second Chaos Faction Warlord, as your input on these videos helps benefit any future player who may one day stumble upon this content and end up joining our community. But with that said, thank you once again for watching, and if you enjoyed this video, be sure to hit that like button and subscribe to my channel if you've not done so already, or if you are already subscribed, you're always encouraged to share this content, as the more people there are that stumble upon these videos, the more people may like what they see, give Conquest a try, end up enjoying the game, and someday end up joining the still growing ranks of our community. If at any point you'd like to get in touch with me, feel free to do so through Facebook or through Twitter, and if you'd like to help me cover some of my file hosting and operating expenses, I'd be honored were you to donate $1 or $2 a month to me on Patreon. But as always, be sure to check back in again soon for ever more Conquest LCG content to come.